My family stole my inheritance until I revealed the secret video evidence to my lawyer. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. Uncle Greg handed me the pen with a smug grin, completely unaware I had his 20-year prison sentence on a flash drive in my pocket. We were sitting in the pristine, glass-walled conference room of Vance & Associates, downtown's most ruthless law firm. Greg was wearing a tailored Italian suit he definitely bought using my grandfather's money, his Rolex catching the morning light. Next to him, my cousin Chloe was busy tapping away on her phone, probably posting another tone-deaf TikTok about her new money aesthetic. They thought I was beaten. They thought I was just the pathetic, broke nephew crawling back to beg for crumbs from the empire they had stolen. Have you ever watched someone you share blood with steal your entire future? It's a very specific, suffocating kind of rage. For my entire 20s, while my friends were building careers, dating, and traveling, I was changing adult diapers. I was managing medication schedules, driving to dialysis appointments, and sitting awake at 3 a.m. holding Grandpa Arthur's hand when the night terrors hit. Arthur wasn't just a wealthy real estate magnate. He was the only true father figure I ever had. He was sharp, tough, and absolutely despised his son Greg's insatiable greed. Arthur promised me time and time again that the historic estate, his life's work, would be mine. He wanted it protected from Greg's debts and Chloe's shallow materialism. I sacrificed everything to keep him comfortable in his final years. But when Arthur finally passed, everything shifted overnight. The man who had promised to protect my future was gone, replaced by a legal nightmare I never saw coming. Greg swooped in with his slick lawyers, waving papers that contradicted everything Arthur had ever told me. He took the house, the accounts, the cars, everything. All those years of loyalty, all those sacrifices erased by a few signatures. Sitting across from them now, staring at the settlement agreement Greg wanted me to sign for a measly 10 grand, I felt my heart pounding against my ribs. I looked at the hidden projector mounted on the ceiling above us. Vance caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The trap was perfectly set, and the bait was taken. I smiled back at my uncle and reached for the pen. To understand how we ended up in that glass room, you have to understand the hell of the last decade. Grandpa Arthur was a self-made man. He built his fortune in construction, starting with nothing but a hammer and calloused hands. His sprawling historic estate wasn't just a house. It was a monument to 80 years of sweat and grit. But his health began failing right after I turned 20. It started with minor forgetfulness, then escalated into mobility issues, and eventually severe heart failure. While Greg was off in Aspen networking and burning through his own trust fund, and Chloe was pretending to go to college on Arthur's dime, I moved in. I didn't hesitate. You don't abandon the people who raised you. For 8 solid years, my world shrank to the size of that estate. I learned how to administer IVs, how to lift a grown man without throwing out my back, and how to decode the slurred mumbles of a proud man losing his autonomy. It was grueling, isolating work. I watched my youth slip by through the massive bay windows of his bedroom. "You're a good boy, Marcus," Arthur would wheeze, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Greg only calls when he needs a bailout. Chloe only visits when she wants a new car. I see them for who they are. This house, the legacy, it all goes to you. I've made sure of it." He repeated that promise like a mantra. But what good is a promise when the people you're dealing with have absolutely no moral compass? Every time Greg did visit, maybe twice a year, he'd walk through the halls taking mental inventory of the antiques. He'd look at me like I was the help, a nuisance standing between him and his rightful payday. "Don't get too comfortable in the master suite, kid," Greg sneered during his last Thanksgiving visit, swirling a glass of Arthur's expensive scotch. When the old man finally croaks, "I'm selling this dusty museum." I brushed it off back then, trusting Arthur's word and his ironclad estate planning. I truly believed the law would protect the truth, completely underestimating the depths of my uncle's depravity. I never imagined how far Greg would actually go to take it all. Arthur passed away quietly on a Tuesday morning. The grief hit me like a physical blow, hollowing out my chest. I had spent a third of my life keeping him alive. Without him, the massive estate felt like a silent tomb. But I didn't even have time to properly mourn before the vultures descended. Barely 3 days after the funeral, Greg summoned me to the formal dining room. He wasn't crying. In fact, he looked practically giddy. Beside him sat a sleazy-looking attorney I had never seen before. "Sit down, Marcus," Greg ordered, treating me like a trespassing stranger in my own home. "We're reading the will." My stomach dropped. Arthur had a longtime lawyer, a man named Vance, but Vance was nowhere to be found. Instead, this stranger pulled out a crisp, white document. As he read the terms, the room started to spin. According to this new will, dated just 2 weeks before Arthur's death, the entire estate, the house, the company, the offshore accounts, went to Greg. Chloe was gifted a massive $5 million trust fund. And me? The grandson who wiped his face and kept him breathing? The document explicitly stated, "To my grandson Marcus, I leave the sum of $1 for his adequate services." It was a slap in the face. A brutal, calculated insult. "This is a fake," I blurted out, standing up. "Arthur hated you, Greg. He told me 1,000 times this house was mine. You forged this." Greg didn't even flinch. He just leaned back in one of Arthur's antique leather chairs and offered me a sickening, triumphant smirk. "Careful, boy," Greg purred, sipping his coffee. "Slander is an ugly thing. Dad changed his mind at the end. Realized blood is thicker than water, I guess." He signed it right in front of 2 witnesses. "It's ironclad." I demanded to see the signature. It looked like Arthur's shaky, late-stage handwriting, but the phrasing was all wrong. Arthur never spoke like that. He never used the phrase adequate services. My mind raced with questions, but the reality of the paper was staring right at me. I was completely trapped by a piece of paper I knew was entirely fraudulent. The eviction notice came exactly 48 hours later. Greg didn't even have the guts to hand it to me himself. He sent private security to escort me off the property. "You have 1 hour to pack your personal belongings," the guard grunted, watching my every move. I scrambled to throw my clothes into garbage bags, my hands shaking with a mix of profound grief and helpless rage. I wasn't allowed to take any of the furniture, not even the armchair I used to sleep in next to Arthur's bed. As I dragged my trash bags down the grand sweeping staircase, Chloe was walking up. She was already wearing Arthur's vintage Patek Philippe watch, a watch he swore he'd be buried in. She held up her phone, recording a video. "Moving day for the freeloader." She giggled into the camera. "Finally getting this place to ourselves. Hashtag new beginnings, hashtag estate life." I didn't say a word. I just walked out into the freezing rain and drove away. I ended up at the cheapest motel I could find on the outskirts of town. Room 114. It smelled like stale smoke and desperation. The neon sign outside buzzed all night, flickering through the thin, stained curtains. I had barely $2,000 to my name. For 8 years, I had received a tiny stipend for my caretaking, pouring everything else back into the household. Now, I was eating instant ramen cooked in a rusty microwave, staring at the peeling wallpaper. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of absolute injustice? It eats at your soul. Every time I opened social media, I was assaulted by Chloe's posts. There she was, popping champagne by Arthur's pool. There was Greg, showing off a brand new Porsche 911 parked in Arthur's driveway. They were living the high life on stolen money, completely erasing my grandfather's true wishes. I spent 3 weeks rotting in that miserable room, spiraling into a deep depression. I was ready to give up, convinced that the bad guys had officially won. I genuinely thought my life was over until my phone buzzed with an unexpected text. It was a Tuesday night when my phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. I opened it to find a picture of my old bedroom at the estate, now completely gutted and painted a sterile white. The text underneath read, "Thought you'd like to see the upgrades, kid. Much better without the hospital smell. P.S. I finally threw out that ugly fake owl statue in the study. Total junk. Uncle Greg." He was taunting me, rubbing salt in the wound just because he could. I stared at the message, anger boiling hot in my veins, but then my eyes caught on one specific detail. The fake owl statue in the study. My breath hitched. Arthur's study was his sanctuary. Sitting on the highest shelf, directly facing the massive mahogany desk where he signed all his documents, was a bronze owl. It wasn't just a statue. "Insurance, Marcus," Arthur had whispered to me a year ago, pointing a trembling finger at the owl. "People get greedy when the end is near." I had an old security buddy wire that thing. Motion activated. Record straight to a hidden SD card inside the base. Nobody knows but you and me. My heart hammered against my ribs. Greg didn't know about the camera. If Greg had forged that will in that study, the owl had seen it all. The footage would still be sitting inside the base, right where Greg had carelessly tossed it. I texted back, forcing my fingers to type calmly. Where did you throw it? The dumpster out back? Greg replied, yeah. Trash pickup isn't until Thursday. You want your junk back? It was Tuesday. I had 48 hours to infiltrate the estate. I knew Greg had hired private security to patrol the perimeter, making any approach extremely dangerous. But I had spent a decade learning every blind spot on that massive property. If I missed this window, the evidence would be lost entirely. I grabbed my dark hoodie and prepared to break into the stolen estate. I waited until midnight before making my move. I parked my beat-up sedan 2 miles down the road and hiked through the dense, muddy woods that bordered the back of Arthur's property. The rain was coming down in sheets, soaking through my cheap jacket, but the adrenaline kept me warm. I knew Chloe was hosting a loud, obnoxious pool party that night. I could hear the thumping bass of the EDM music echoing through the trees long before I saw the glow of the estate lights. Perfect. The noise would cover my tracks. I slipped through a gap in the wrought iron fence that I used to sneak out of when I was a teenager. The estate looked alien now, crawling with strangers drinking and laughing on the sprawling lawns. I hugged the shadows, creeping my way toward the massive industrial dumpsters hidden behind the catering kitchen. The smell hit me first, a mix of rotting food, wet cardboard, and stale beer. I hoisted myself up and quietly slipped inside the metal bin. It was pitch black and disgusting. I had to rely entirely on touch, digging through slimy bags of garbage, shattered glass bottles, and discarded party decorations. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Panic started to claw at my throat. What if Greg was lying? What if he had already smashed the owl or pawned it? Have you ever felt the crushing weight of time running out while your hands are literally buried in filth? I was just about to give up when my fingers brushed against something cold, heavy, and metallic. The textured bronze feathers. The sharp beak. It was the owl. I pulled it out, my hands trembling violently, and flipped it upside down. The base was secured with 4 tiny Phillips head screws. I used the small blade on my keychain to desperately pry the bottom plate open. Inside, tucked beneath a mess of intricate wiring, was a tiny, black microSD card. I popped it out and secured it in my pocket just as a flashlight beam swept over the top of the dumpster. A security guard was walking straight toward my hiding spot. Hey, who left this side gate open? A gruff voice barked. The beam of the heavy-duty mag light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the brick wall right above my head. I held my breath, pressing my back flat against the cold, slimy metal interior of the dumpster. The squelch of the guard's heavy boots grew louder, stopping mere inches from the metal siding. My heart was pounding so hard I was terrified he would hear it over the thumping bass of Chloe's pool party. I slowly reached into my pocket, my fingers tightly gripping the tiny SD card. If he looked inside and found me, I wouldn't just be arrested for trespassing. Greg would absolutely ensure this memory card was destroyed. Probably the caterers, another voice mumbled, approaching from the patio. Just lock it up. Boss wants the perimeter tight. The flashlight beam swept away. I heard the loud clank of the gate shutting, followed by the click of a heavy padlock. I waited 10 agonizing minutes, counting my breaths, before I dared to peek over the rim. The alleyway was completely empty. I scrambled out of the garbage, reeking of old food and stale beer, and melted back into the shadows of the tree line. The hike back to my car felt like an eternity. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. By the time I finally locked the doors of my sedan, I was completely soaked in sweat and freezing rain. I didn't even bother taking off my ruined clothes. I just jammed the key into the ignition and sped away, watching the glowing lights of Arthur's stolen estate fade in the rearview mirror. I drove well under the speed limit, absolutely terrified of getting pulled over with the most important piece of plastic in the world sitting in my cup holder. I made it back to my dingy motel room at 3 a.m. I locked the deadbolt, pulled the flimsy chain across the door, and closed the blinds tight. I pulled my cheap, battered laptop from my backpack and booted it up. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely insert the SD card into the side port. A small folder popped up on the screen, titled DCM. I took a deep breath and opened the very last video file. The video player buffered for an agonizing second before the 4K footage snapped into crystal clear focus. The camera angle was perfect, capturing the entirety of Arthur's dark, wood-paneled study from the high vantage point of the bookshelf. The timestamp in the bottom corner read 11:42 p.m., dated exactly 2 weeks before my grandfather died. The room was illuminated only by the small brass lamp on the desk. Arthur was sitting in his wheelchair, looking incredibly frail, an oxygen tube taped beneath his nose. Then, the heavy oak door swung open. Uncle Greg walked in, followed by the sleazy lawyer from the will reading. Greg wasn't smiling. He looked desperate and angry. "Sign the damn paper, Dad," Greg hissed, slapping a crisp document onto the desk. "I'm not asking anymore." Arthur slowly shook his head, his voice a raspy whisper captured perfectly by the owl's hidden microphone. "No. I told you, Greg. The estate goes to Marcus. You'll squander it all on your debts. I won't let you ruin my legacy. Have you ever watched a monster reveal its true face?" Greg's demeanor completely snapped. He leaned down, gripping the arms of Arthur's wheelchair, his face inches from the old man's. "You owe $5 million to the wrong people, Dad?" "No, I do. And if I don't pay them by the end of the month, they're going to break my legs. I am not going down for this." Greg snatched the pen and physically grabbed Arthur's frail, trembling hand. Arthur cried out in pain, trying to pull away, but Greg was too strong. With the sleazy lawyer watching the door, Greg forcefully guided Arthur's hand across the signature line, entirely forging the signature through physical coercion. "There," Greg panted, stepping back and snatching the paper. "Witnessed and signed. You're a good father after all." He left Arthur weeping silently in the dim light. I sat in my motel room, tears streaming down my face, sick to my stomach. I had the ultimate proof of their felony. I secured the evidence and prepared to unleash absolute legal hell. The next morning, I stood outside the imposing glass doors of Vance and Associates. Richard Vance was a legend in the city's legal circles, a shark of an estate attorney who had represented Arthur for 20 years until Greg conveniently fired him right after the funeral. Vance was known for being ruthless, sharp, and utterly merciless in the courtroom. I walked into his opulent office smelling like cheap motel soap, looking completely out of place among the leather-bound books and modern art. "Marcus," Vance said, looking up from his mahogany desk. His sharp blue eyes softened just a fraction. I was incredibly sorry to hear about Arthur, and even sorrier when Greg presented that absurd new will. Unfortunately, without proof of coercion, my hands were entirely tied. I didn't say a word. I just walked up to his desk, pulled the tiny micro-SD card from my pocket, and set it down precisely on his leather blotter. "I have proof," I said simply. Vance raised an eyebrow, inserted the card into his tablet, and hit play. For the next 3 minutes, the grand office was dead silent, save for the horrifying audio of Greg physically forcing my dying grandfather to forge a legal document. I watched Vance's face. He didn't gasp. He didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, dangerous, predatory smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed a loaded bazooka. "Is this legally admissible?" I asked, my voice tight. Vance leaned back, tinting his fingers. "Oh, Marcus, this is far better than admissible. This is elder abuse, felony forgery, and blatant fraud. Your uncle is looking at a minimum of 15 to 20 years in federal prison." He tossed the tablet onto the desk. "We could take this straight to the police right now. But where's the fun in that? If we simply arrest him, the estate gets tied up in probate hell for years." Vance stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with chilling precision. "We will let your uncle walk right into his own destruction." Vance's plan was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. We needed to corner Greg so entirely that he would surrender the estate immediately to avoid prison, skipping years of messy legal battles. The first step was playing the victim. Under Vance's strict direction, I sent Greg a pathetic, pleading email. I told him the motel was draining my last few dollars, that I couldn't find a job, and that I was utterly desperate. I begged him for a tiny sliver of the estate just to survive. Have you ever had to swallow your pride and beg the person who ruined your life? It made me physically ill to type the words, but I kept my eyes on the prize. 2 hours later, Vance made the official call. He contacted Greg's sleazy attorney, offering a total and complete surrender. Vance explained that I was willing to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and permanently relinquish all future claims to Arthur's estate in exchange for a miserable $10,000. It was a humiliatingly low number, carefully chosen to stroke Greg's massive ego. "He'll take it," Vance assured me, pouring 2 cups of black coffee. "Men like Greg are blinded by their own arrogance. He wants you crushed, and a $10,000 payout is the ultimate insult. He won't be able to resist watching you sign away your birthright." Vance was absolutely right. Less than an hour later, Greg's lawyer called back. Not only did they accept the absurdly low offer, but Greg insisted on doing the signing in person. He wanted to gloat. He wanted to look me in the eye and watch me surrender. The meeting was set for Friday morning at Vance's downtown office. We spent the next 48 hours drafting the fake settlement papers and wiring the conference room for the main event. We connected Vance's laptop to the massive ceiling projector, testing the volume to ensure Arthur's final words would echo off the glass walls. The bait was dangling right over the shark tank, completely perfectly disguised. I finally slept, dreaming of the brutal reckoning that was coming. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and a biting wind. I wore my best suit, the one I had bought for Arthur's funeral, and sat in Vance's conference room, staring at the polished mahogany table. Exactly at 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors swung open. Uncle Greg strutted in, wearing a ridiculously expensive tailored Italian suit, looking like he owned the entire city. And right behind him was Cousin Chloe, holding an iced coffee and sporting a designer handbag that cost more than my car. Greg had brought her along just to witness my total humiliation. Well, Greg sneered, pulling out a leather chair and throwing his legs up, casually crossing his ankles. "Look who finally decided to join the real world. I told you, Marcus, fighting me was a stupid, expensive mistake." Chloe didn't even look up from her phone, busy snapping a picture of the skyline view. "Can we make this quick?" she whined. "I have a personal shopper appointment at noon." Vance sat quietly at the head of the table, his face a perfectly blank, unreadable mask. He slid the thick stack of settlement papers across the smooth wood. "The terms are simple," Vance said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Marcus accepts $10,000. In return, he completely waives all rights to contest the will, challenges to the estate, and any future legal action against you, Greg." Greg laughed, a loud, grating sound that made my fists clench under the table. He pulled a gold Mont Blanc pen from his breast pocket, another one of Arthur's treasures. "Smartest thing you've done all year, kid," Greg said, tapping the pen against the paper. "You take this little handout, you disappear, and we never have to see your pathetic face again." He slid the document toward me, a disgusting, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure they could hear it. I looked at the pen, then looked up at the ceiling. Vance pulled a black remote from his pocket and locked the doors. Click. The heavy magnetic locks on the conference room doors engaged with a loud, final thud. Greg paused, his triumphant smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second. "What was that?" he asked, glancing back over his shoulder. Vance ignored the question entirely. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany. "Before my client signs away his entire life, Greg, there is one minor piece of housekeeping we need to review regarding the estate's inventory." Greg rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed. "Inventory? We already cataloged everything. The house, the cars, the accounts. It's all mine. Just sign the damn paper, Marcus." Vance tapped a single button on his laptop keyboard. "Actually, you missed one very specific item," Vance said, his voice dropping to a deadly, icy whisper. "A small bronze owl from Arthur's study." Greg's face went instantly pale. The blood drained from his cheeks so fast he looked like a corpse. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, sensing the sudden, suffocating shift in the room's atmosphere. "What are you talking about?" Greg stammered, his voice suddenly losing all of its arrogant bass. "I threw that piece of junk away." I smiled, sliding the unsigned settlement paper back across the table. "I know," I said. "I went and fished it out." I nodded at Vance. Vance hit the master button on the small black remote. The motorized projector screen slowly dropped from the ceiling behind Greg. The room's automated blackout blinds smoothly descended, plunging us into cinematic darkness. Greg stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. "What the hell is this?" "Open the doors, Vance. We're leaving." But he was trapped. The high-definition projector flickered to life, casting a bright light directly onto Greg's terrified face. "No, I told you, Greg. The estate goes to Marcus." Arthur's recorded voice boomed from the speakers. The clarity of the video was utterly devastating. Greg stared in absolute horror as his own felony played on the massive screen. The 4K video played in all its horrifying glory. There was Greg, 50 feet wide on the projector screen, physically grabbing Arthur's frail wrist and forcing his hand across the forged document. The audio was crystal clear. "I am not going down for this," the digital Greg hissed through the surround sound speakers. Have you ever seen an arrogant man's entire ego shatter into a million pieces? It is a profoundly beautiful thing to witness. In the conference room, the real Greg collapsed back into his chair, sweating profusely, his mouth hanging open in silent shock. Beside him, Chloe dropped her designer bag onto the floor. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide with mounting terror as she finally realized her millions were built on a brutal felony. That's a deep fake," Greg stammered desperately, his voice cracking into a high pitch. "You fabricated this. It's illegal." Vance let out a low, humorless chuckle and paused the video exactly on the frame where Greg's hand was wrapped around Arthur's. The timestamp, 11:42 p.m., glowed brightly in the corner. "Save the theatrics for the jury, Greg," Vance said sharply. "I already had the raw file authenticated by a digital forensics expert. It holds up in federal court. What we just watched is elder abuse, felony coercion, and wire fraud." Vance tossed a thick legal binder onto the table. "I have the police on speed dial and a detective friend waiting downstairs. If I make the call, you will be arrested in this room, handcuffed, and perp-walked through the lobby in your fancy Italian suit. You will spend the next 2 decades eating terrible prison food." Chloe started sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her hands as her luxurious lifestyle evaporated before her eyes. Greg looked utterly destroyed, his shoulders slumped, unable to even meet my gaze. He knew he was entirely beaten. He raised his shaking hands and stared at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "What do you want?" Greg whispered, his voice completely broken. He wasn't a predator anymore. He was just a pathetic, cornered rat. I stood up, leaning over the table, finally claiming the power he had stolen from me. "I want everything back," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I want the estate deed transferred to my name by noon today. I want every single cent you and Chloe spent over the last month reimbursed from your own personal accounts. I want the fake will legally nullified. And I want you out of my city forever." Vance slid a new, massive stack of papers across the table. It wasn't a settlement. It was a total, unconditional surrender document. "Sign it, Greg," Vance commanded. "Or I hit play, the file goes to the district attorney, and the police come up." Greg's hands shook violently as he picked up the very same gold Mont Blanc pen he had tried to use against me just minutes ago. He signed every single page, legally transferring the entire estate, the trust funds, and the business holdings back to me, the rightful heir. He systematically destroyed his own life with a few strokes of ink. Chloe just wept loudly, realizing she would have to get a real job to pay off her massive credit card debts. Once the last signature was placed, Vance hit the button to unlock the conference room doors. "Leave," Vance ordered calmly, "before my client changes his mind about calling the cops." Greg and Chloe stumbled out of the glass office like ghosts, their fraudulent empire completely annihilated in less than 20 minutes. The silence in the room was deafening. I looked down at the signed documents, the undeniable proof that Arthur's legacy was finally safe. The overwhelming weight of the past decade, the sacrifices, the grief, the betrayals, finally lifted off my shoulders. I sank into my chair and let out a long breath, feeling tears well up. The war was officially over, and the good guys had finally won. I walked out of the law firm as the sole owner of a massive empire. It has been a year since that fateful day in Vance's office, and my life looks completely different now. Greg fled the state, drowning in his original debts with no estate to bail him out. I heard rumors he's working as a mid-level manager somewhere in Nevada, dodging creditors every single day. Chloe deleted all her social media accounts after I legally forced her to return the vintage watches and the cars she bought with stolen money. As for me, I moved back into the historic estate. I didn't change a single thing in Arthur's study. except for putting that beautiful bronze owl right back on the highest shelf where it belongs. I hired a proper property management team to handle the daily operations of the estate, allowing me to finally start living my own life. I'm traveling, I'm dating, and I'm finally enjoying the youth I sacrificed. But the scars of that betrayal still linger. Have you ever had to permanently cut out the people who share your DNA? It is a harsh reality to accept, but it teaches you a vital lesson. True family isn't determined by bloodlines. It is determined by loyalty, sacrifice, and mutual respect. Arthur was my real family. Greg and Chloe were just genetic parasites waiting for a payday. If you are ever put in a position of caring for a wealthy, ailing relative, my greatest advice is to protect yourself immediately. Get an ironclad lawyer like Vance, secure the legal documents early, and never underestimate the blinding, destructive power of human greed. People will smile in your face while actively plotting to steal your entire future. Always have an insurance policy, and never be afraid to fight back with absolute ruthlessness when backed into a corner. Justice rarely happens on its own. You have to meticulously build the trap and force the truth into the light. My grandfather built this empire from the ground up, and he trusted me to protect it from the exact monsters who tried to tear it apart. I look at the bronze owl every morning and smile at my grandfather's final victory.